All right, since you were all kind
Not
enough to be
involved
here on
with
time, we
that
won't
I'm
keep
aware
you
of.
waiting. Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Bob Samores, representing the Belmont Forum, which I'll get into in a second. And I'm joined by Ed Gerstner from Springer Nature, Caroline Sutton from Taylor Francis, Iratze Puebla from PLOS and PLOS One, and Scott Kahn representing the Helmsley Charitable Trust. The idea behind this session is to help you as editors and publishers understand a little bit better what it is that both funders and some of your colleagues in the publishing world are beginning to expect and do when it comes to open data. This is not open access. This is really about open data and data accessibility, and help you understand what's coming at you and what the kinds of steps are that you could take to um, uh, align your publications with what's happening in the open data movement. So, just a quick introduction. The Belmont Forum is a consortium of about 30 national science funding agencies and another couple of dozen research councils and other organizations that funds transdisciplinary and transnational global environmental change research. It's been putting out calls for research proposals since 2012 and has funded almost 20 of them now. And you have some data there in terms of what it's actually been doing. But a piece of the Belmont activity over the last several years has been to try to help figure out what practices, policies, and procedures the Belmont Forum as a consortium should be developing and implementing in order to accelerate open data sharing, accessibility, reusability, et cetera. So there was a project that lasted until about the end of February of this year called the E-Infrastructures and Data Management Initiative. And the idea behind it was to look at several different elements behind open data sharing, both in terms of policy, training, technical and technological impediments to open data sharing, et cetera. And in the area of data policy and planning, two particular developments relevant to this group were the creation of what's called the Data and Digital Objects Management Annex, Management Plan Annex, which lays out the requirements of all Belmont Forum proposers, even beginning at the pre-proposal stage, in terms of what kind of information is expected about how they're going to manage the data coming from the science that would be funded through a Belmont grant. At the pre-proposal stage, the questions are pretty basic, pretty preliminary, but the intent is to, even if at that early stage, to get people to be thinking about what kind of data is coming in, how it's going to be managed, how it's going to be archived and preserved and made accessible. And then at the full proposal stage, there are more questions that need to be answered. And then once a proposal is funded, there's a requirement for a full data management plan that will be put in place. And then the other activity of note was about a year and a half long collaboration with a number of publishers, beginning with a workshop in London in June of 2017 that was designed to see if there was a way to harmonize the expectations that researchers would be seeing from the very beginning of a project all the way through to publication. And so the group developed a data accessibility statement, which was approved by the Belmont Forum plenary in 2018, and the elements of which have been incorporated into the Data and Digital Objects Management Plan Annex for Belmont, and it tracks closely to what a lot of the publishers have already been putting together. The collaboration was also done under the auspices of the RDA interest group on standardization of data policies. So that's just a very quick background on where this particular group of funders is coming from. We'll hear also at the end of the presentations some information from the private sector funding community, but just to lay some groundwork of where we're coming from. Now I'll turn it to Ed.
Hey there. Well, that's who I am. So I've been at Nature since 2002, an editor of various forms with various journals, and then in 2012 I moved to China to help build our first editorial office in Shanghai. In August last year, I came back to the UK, so I'm based in the UK, and I'm now the director of journal policy and strategy. Okay. Now, where nature is coming at, or Spring in Nature now is coming at this, is from the many stories and the crisis that's going on in terms of reproducibility. Um, there is a crisis of confidence in science, and one of the reasons for that crisis is that many people have pointed out that many of the studies that are published in the literature you can't reproduce. If you can't reproduce them, is that really science? And we have are of the opinion, or it's become clear to us, that one way that we can help address this situation is greater transparency in the whole process. So open access has aspects to do with that, but making the whole, all parts of scientific publishing and more broadly scholarly publishing, it doesn't just affect the natural sciences, is to open everything up. Open methods, open protocols, and what we're talking about here is open data. Now, in the context of the crisis, we did a poll of researchers to work out whether or not the research community felt there was a crisis in reproducibility. The one thing that was perhaps not surprising was that 70% of the over 1,500 people that we interviewed, over 70% that at one time or another, when they tried to reproduce someone else's work, they had failed to do so. What I found most extraordinary about this poll was that fully half of the people that we asked said that at one time or another they weren't able to reproduce their own research. And this reflects, actually, this was reflected in a study that we did in Nature Genetics in 2009. There was a study of previous papers published in Nature Genetics. Now, this is genetics that should be at the top of its game. So we did an analysis of, or some authors did an analysis of the reproducibility of papers that were published in genetics. This was microarray data. And of the, I think was it 17? I've forgotten the numbers now. 18 papers. Only 2 of those studies could be reproduced in their entirety. 6 were partially reproduced, and 10 could not be reproduced at all. Now, what the authors of this study noted was that those papers that could be reproduced were the ones that were the most open, that were published alongside their data, published alongside their methods. And those papers that couldn't be reproduced were the papers where the authors tried to keep hold of their data, didn't publish it anywhere, didn't open it up anywhere. And I think this was a fairly strong piece of evidence to the expectation that greater openness, greater accessibility of data will help the reproducibility problem. Next slide. And there are benefits. I think one of the things, a lot of this conversation has been around entreating researchers to be good citizens of the research community, seeing openness as a good in itself, and that people should, out of the kindness of their heart, be more open. But there is increasing evidence, and I think we're only going to move the dial if we demonstrate that being more open benefits the researchers themselves. And one of the most striking demonstrations of this is a study of social science data that's been commissioned by NSF and NIH, over 7,000 studies. And what they found was that studies that were born open, or that were conducted in a milieu in which they were intending to open up their data sets to the world, they were actually more productive even within their groups. So they found that those that opened up their data sets produced twice as many papers as those that didn't. And this is even before opening up the data opens up opportunities for those data sets to be used by other scholars. And I think that what this is telling us is that if you collect data, if you bring your data together from an attitude of how do I make this useful to other people, your data becomes more useful to you. And as a consequence, it becomes more productive. You get a bigger bang for your buck. And so I think part of this conversation really does have to be about encouraging researchers to think open from the very beginning, not think once they've done their research and published their paper, how am I going to give this data away, to have them thinking about that from conception. The other benefit to researchers is that papers that are published alongside their papers that are published alongside their data tend to be cited more often. And I don't find that surprising, because papers that are published alongside of their data are more useful, and more useful research is naturally more cited. Next step. Oh. And so we've, for a long time, we've been developing or trying to understand data policies, and in the context of how do we do better. So it started with understanding the range of different policies that various journals have, and categorizing them in 4 different types, and then working out what needs to be done to move journals that merely encourage the idea of opening up data to requiring authors to actually say how readers can access the data. And so BMC journals have required data availability statements since 2012. And at Spring and Nature, we've begun looking at how we push this out across the company. So there's been an increase in the rise of data availability statements. These can take a number of different forms, from you can find the data over there to if you want the data, these are the people that you need to email. Next one. But this isn't without cost. Implementing, it's not just a matter of saying that people should include these data availability statements. It does require some degree of cost from the publisher to make sure that they are, in terms of governance, to make sure that they are actually putting these statements in. And if they are saying it's available over there, checking the link to make sure it is indeed available there. And we've done an analysis that it takes about 10 minutes extra per paper on average. You can see the spread over there. But we think that cost is worth it, because publishing research without data is advertising. It's not science. Without the data is the core, the key, the bedrock of the science. And if people can't build on that data and use that data and scrutinize that data, the paper is much less useful than it could be or should be. There we go.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Caroline Sutton, and I'll talk a little bit about, so that was a lot of the why data sharing policies and a bit of what they might look like. I'm going to show you a little bit of what our policies look like, and some of our thinking as well as we were introducing that. So maybe you can just jump to the next slide there. We introduced a suite of data sharing policies in early 2018 at Taylor & Francis. And a couple of things that were important when we were thinking about this, and I do want to give some kudos to Springer Nature, because obviously having gone first with that was very useful for us. And so I hope that ours can also be useful to others who are looking to implement things. And as we were structuring this, there were a couple of things that were important to me. One was recognizing that we have about half of our portfolio is in humanities and social sciences, half is in STEM. So we need to really think about where are folks at. I also wanted to think, I want to be able to have some pedagogical tools, because I think one of the roles that we have as a publisher is that we can help to catalyze conversations about these topics where they may not be taking place as yet. We are working with many, many societies at Taylor & Francis. We're working with editors, folks on the front lines, and they just might have been thinking about it a little bit, but can we challenge them? Can we push them to think about where are you right now? Where's your community right now? Where do you think they might be in a few years' time? So we also wanted to give them something that also allowed them to think of this as a part of a journal's editorial development plan, where we start now with a policy and where we might be in 2, 3, 5 years' time. So we created a set of policies, and they are structured in a couple of ways. We typically think about data as being open or closed, very binary. But we think about it, and I think a lot of the policies out there actually think about it as more falling along a continuum, that there's different stages of being open. So ours move from, if we put aside the basic for right now, but it's from share upon reasonable request to data that's publicly available, but maybe not with a license that allows a lot of reuse, to an open data policy where actually having the CC BY or CC0 license is important to the open data policy, and then to open and fully fair. And we recognize that open and fully fair might be very difficult initially for many subject areas because while findable, accessible, and reusable in terms of licensing is quite known, but that interoperability really varies from subject area to subject area. And we knew that we would be dependent on conversations with subject areas to think about what that might mean and what that might look like. So what we did was we rolled out the basic data sharing policy to over 1,800 of our titles, so everything that we owned and those societies that agreed to this. And we're now working in 2019 and further in 2020 to move as many journals as possible to more progressive policies. The basic policy just says we want to encourage you to share your data, to include a data availability statement, and to cite that data. And actually our teams, if you do say that you've got a data set that you're sharing, we do then actually follow up and make sure, have you got a data availability statement and are you citing the data? Because those are important elements. So that's why also along the left there, other elements in a data policy that are important to think about are the data availability statement, the data citation, the persistent identifier, of course, and then thinking about what license needs to be applied. We also considered having peer review or not peer review in this, but we actually decided initially that we weren't going to introduce peer review at this time as being something to dig into. We wanted to get folks used to the idea of data sharing policies and having those conversations, and then we can add that on in the next stage. And again, one of the things that we also had to consider, do we just have a conversation by conversation and try and push people to be as progressive as possible? Or we ended up doing what we did. We just push and we introduce this basic policy, which is actually rather weak, but we managed to get that on over 1,800 titles, almost 1,900. And that's at least got folks having to have that conversation, to think about it and to be confronted with it in the instructions for authors. So if we just click again, as I said, this is really an important element also when we're having conversations. We serve many, many different disciplines. And even within the humanities, we've got, I think it's over 200 sub-disciplines of humanities. Some have a kind of situation like digital humanities where they set up a type of experiment, they run it, and they are creating data similar to those who walk into a lab and create their data. But we also have folks whose lab is actually a museum and who are very much involved with reinterpreting pre-existing artifacts. And so we've got a lot of questions from them saying, well, what the heck is data and what are you talking about? And this is why that variability was really important to us. And I just want to point out, I've got a colleague, Vicky Truder, who's here, is working on her master's thesis, who is looking at what these policies might mean in these areas. So just the last slide quickly to let you know, I think one of the important things here is support for authors and for the editors is really important. So we set up a author services website that's got lots of information, among other things, points people to templates for data availability statements, which have not yet been updated with the Belmont Forum editions, but we will be doing that. We also have frequently asked questions, and those are in fact frequently updated, or at least we're in the beginning as we saw new and new questions. Set up an email address, which is also important if you're thinking about introducing these policies. And of course, updating the instructions for authors is also a really critical element in this. But first and foremost was really communicating with our editors, and in many cases having to pick up a phone or go visit them in person on the front lines to talk to them about what this meant, because some of them were fearful that we were just going to push everybody to immediately share everything open, even though the basic clearly doesn't state that, but that's what they read it. And from that, I'll turn over to PLOS.
Thank you. Okay. Well, my name is Irache Puebla. I'm senior managing editor for the journal PLOS One. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm a member of the editorial team at PLOS, which is obviously an open access publisher. I support very much everything that has been said about the benefits of sharing data. We support any efforts towards open research and transparency. What I'm going to be discussing here briefly is the PLOS data policy and what our experience has been over the last 5 years. So the current PLOS data policy was implemented in March 2014. It was actually an update of a policy that we already had across all of the journals in the portfolio, which already expected authors to share the data underlying their papers upon request. So the motivation for this update was really to try to make that sharing faster at the time of publication and to reduce some of the burden involved in contacting authors and seeing if they still have the data several years later, etc. The two main elements under the update to the data policy were that we moved to a situation where we mandated the authors had to make all of the data underlying their articles at the time of publication, and this should be without restriction, although we did add some text to the policy to account for possible exceptions, for example, regarding ethical or legal restrictions that the authors may face, and we wanted to take that into account in terms of our requirements. And the second element coming under this update to the policy was that we would be publishing a data availability statement with each of the articles. Next, please. So this is an example of what the data statement looks like. It's one of the statements that we provide as part of the metadata with the publications. Next, please. And the idea for this is that the data availability statement provides information as to how the authors are complying with the policy, and giving that transparency so that readers can see exactly where the data can be accessed. In this example, it was deposited at the Dryer repository. And also, if there were to be any restrictions to the sharing of the data set, they could be explained there. Next, please. One of the things that we've been discussing, and I think it's important, is to consider that data sharing culture is not the same across disciplines. Caroline has alluded to this when she was discussing policies. As I mentioned, this is policy that applies to all of the PLOS journals, which are mostly in the biomedical fields. But for example, PLOS One has a scope that is actually broader than that, and we do also consider physical sciences and even social sciences research. So we've been working with different communities to try to foster data sharing across many, many different disciplines. Next, please. So as a brief summary of what we have seen in the 5 years since we implemented the policy, we have now published over 115,000 articles with a data statement. Again, this is across the 7 PLOS journals. When we implemented this policy, there was quite a bit of response from the research communities, some very positive, some a bit less so. We had some comments suggesting that we may face quite a bit of challenge in terms of reservations by authors to share their data sets. That has not been our experience. We have actually rejected very few submissions. Essentially, if there is a lack of compliance, we'll reject the submission. We have rejected a very, very small number of submissions because the authors were unable or unwilling to share the data set. And something I want to mention is that what we are observing based on the information on the data availability statements is that in around a quarter of the statements, the authors are mentioning the use of repositories, of data repositories. This is not as high as we would like it to be, but there has been a positive trend compared to when we first implemented the policy in terms of more authors using data repositories. Next, please. And then just to finish briefly, I thought I'd mention a few things of what we have learned in this process. And if we were to start discussing the implementation of the policy all over again tomorrow, I guess there may be important things to consider as part of those conversations. As I have mentioned, and my colleagues here have also mentioned before, there will need to be specificities related to specific research disciplines. They do not all have the same culture of sharing or the same requirements, and it is important to build that into any policies that are developed. Something very clear for us is the fact that we actually have to account for publications from clinical disciplines or that include human subjects data, and we included restrictions or different frameworks to account for those. As I mentioned, we think it's important to encourage the use of data repositories, which are actually there designed to hold the data sets. Journals were not set for this. We can take some data, but the data repositories are actually much better placed and can provide also metadata and curation of data sets. We have seen quite a bit of conversations around compliance. You have this policy at PLOS, but are you actually seeing that every paper has the data with it? The answer is on plus one, no. But the approach we have taken is that we want to work on awareness and education, and essentially not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we are seeing actually a rather positive trend in terms of more authors sharing data and also awareness among reviewers, for example, during the peer review process. And then finally, it is very important to consider incentives for the researchers to share their data. As Ed was saying, you're going to have much more support if the researcher sees what's in it for them. And it is much easier to implement and move ahead with these policies if there is community buy-in. So this is something to consider. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And as I said, the private funders are also very interested in funding openness. One of them being the Helmsley Charitable Trust. I just want to say I am consulting for them, but I'm not the trust, so I always like to distinguish that. I'll give my best description, um, but they're ultimately the ones that are involved. The trust, just to give people a sense of who they are, is they invest in a couple of health related areas to try to improve the lives of people. The three big projects that they focus on are type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, and then healthcare being delivered in rural or underserved communities, which I always say they only deal with the easy stuff when it comes to healthcare. They've awarded approaching now $2 billion since 2009. They do have a very unique focus on open data, and I am involved a lot with what's going on in the open science community, where there's probably more of an emphasis, at least thus far, on open access. And Helmsley really focuses on open data. We kind of share the views that these three have already said about the relevance, the reproducibility, and the utility of having data available for use. And I guess the program started roughly 3 years ago. We released for type 1 diabetes data sharing policy in 2018 that's being implemented in grants. We're starting to do it for Crohn's, and I would actually echo what you had said. It's not only there's differences between different fields of study, even within biomedical, there are differences within communities. Type 1 diabetes has been much more amenable to sharing data than Crohn's, for example. And we all have our hypotheses why, but it's just an interesting observation. With regard to our experiences thus far, I wanted to give you the sense that from a funder's perspective, this is very much a work in progress. That I work with the staff at the Helmsley Trust around implementing the policy for grants of all sizes. They have very small pilot grants, very large, as in tens of millions of dollars, observational studies that go on for 5 years. And how do you implement this policy in multiple cases? And then enforcement is something that I guess philosophically the trust believes in using the carrot, not the stick. So apropos data use agreements and actually following up on if they actually put their data there, we have a sense of how we're going to do it. But I'd say it's one of those areas that it's hard to go against human nature, and so it'd just be better if people use the carrot and the encouragement rather than having funders come down and say you haven't done this, you won't get the last part of your grant. I'd say in terms of reactions, the reactions have been all across the board. Initially, everyone, I think when you grow up in science, I think you're almost taught to be a data hoarder. And what's nice is that after you talk through and people have an appreciation for the benefits, that many of them come around and saying, yes, that's well motivated, appropriate for the science, helps with all sorts of things. But there are definitely those that are still grappling with the notion of lack of control over their data, whether it's perceived or real. And I would kind of echo the one statement about reusability and interoperability. I think that is one area of open data that the community has only scratched the surface. because it's one thing to put data out on a repository. It's another to have data fields that you can actually join with other data sets and that is standardized to the point where you can actually use it. And I say that as a recovering data scientist, I suppose, is what I should say at this stage. Um, and so on my last slide, if I look forward in where Helmsley is trying to put its money and trying to help both with infrastructure and with the projects that they do, number one, we strongly encourage / try to enforce that people put their data on infrastructure that's professionally managed. Sounds like a silly thing, but the number of $10 million data sets that sit on the graduate students' PC under their desk, it's alarming. It's just alarming. So think about that in context of when they say they're putting data, it should be managed, backed up, all that sort of thing. We think it's really important to use standards. The Helmsley is funding CDISC to try to, which is one of the standards organizations trying to extend standards for type 1 diabetes and for Crohn's. And it's something we'd like to just see more encouragement, to use existing standards and to extend existing standards because it helps in terms of being able to marry data sets together. We do make investments in adding data to data sets solely for the purpose of sharing that data more reliably and in a more interoperable fashion. What does that mean? In the biomedical field, a lot of I think it's more of a training that you are parsimonious in what you collect. You collect just the data fields to answer your questions, and yet that often makes the data set not as useful as it needs to be. So we fund it for one data set. We're funding the collection of genotype information because it's then connectable to others. We do work a lot with harmonization of consents. Personal experience this last week is how people interpret GDPR in Europe and how that affects consents. There is not a standard, and it's becoming an issue, so it has to be worked through. And then lastly, data repositories. It's been mentioned. This is one area that I just think needs to be developed a lot further. We are Helmsley is investing in some repositories, and they'll invest in the future. So I guess to help on the publishing side, it's great to encourage people to put data in repositories, but I think from the funding side, we need to make sure that there are well-funded, suitable places to put the data. That's it. Thanks.
Well, very much. So I've given you a lot to chew on. I'm sure you're familiar with some of it, if not a lot of it. But we want to really now hear from you, both about your experiences, questions on how you might be trying to move forward or how you can move forward based on the experiences here up at the front of the room. So please, this is really designed to be the discussion part of the presentation. So don't be shy. Yes. So just to repeat, for if you couldn't hear, it was basically what's the role of publishers in ensuring there's compliance in data accessibility?
But I think it is our responsibility. The trick that we've often found is if they refuse to be compliant, what next? And I think the only enforcement mechanism we have for that is to note it and to let the referees know the next time they submit a paper to say these authors are reluctant to share their data with anyone, so take that into account when you're reviewing their paper. Because if you're not willing to share your data, I think that's a red flag. And so that's the only thing. We haven't actually said that. Maybe we should say that if you don't comply, the compliance actually hasn't been that difficult to enforce. But I think it is our responsibility.
Uh, I agree with what Ed was saying. I think there needs to be a certain level of responsibility, especially, I mean, thinking about that from the plus perspective. If we say we had this policy, you had to kind of walk the talk to some extent. It is true that there is a certain level of challenge associated with it because, I mean, part of it is, it was referred to earlier, there is going to be a cost. Essentially, the checks don't happen just magically out of the blue. There needs to be staff who can handle that. It can be time consuming. Usually the more data you're given, the more you have to check. um, so there needs to be a commitment from the publisher in putting some resources on it. What we have done at PLOS is we have a certain staff members who are specialized on data checks as well, so they build that knowledge internally. Something else that we have done is we also have a data advisory group, which is an external group who advises us again to account for compliance is not the same for human subjects research data set to genomic sequence. So there needs to be a certain level of responsibility. I think that what my advice would be was not to be necessarily just blinded again, so that it is 100% perfect from the outset. You can always start with doing your best and build on it.
And from the funder perspective, we'd love it if there was a closer tie, like, and I'd say more strict adherence to, if they don't publish the data, they don't publish the paper. I can say we struggle, the trust struggles with saying no to people who have a wonderful application for a study but are reticent to share their data. And the discipline there has been to actually say no. And sometimes they come around and say okay. But I mean, I know it's hard on the publishing side, but it would be really fantastic.
In some disciplines,
and this is biomedical.
But in like genomes, if you don't give us the ascension code, we don't publish the paper. Like that, it doesn't get accepted unless you can point us to the data. And so that's straightforward. It's for the bits that don't have a community standard in terms of that sort of requirement or expectation that it becomes difficult.
Yep.
Okay, we've got another question in the back.
I have a question for Scott about the last point you made, data repositories lacking in many areas. I'm curious, I'm coming from a university library and we provide data repository services for our faculty. So where do you see it lacking? I mean, I know a lot of university libraries are providing these Dataverse, instances where their faculty can put their data, and we, give them DOIs and everything that they need, and there is no charge for this service. So where do you see the lacking?
So and we definitely looked at the Dataverse as one source of multiple places that you can put data. I guess we approached it differently. We said if we wanted to put type 1 diabetes data, where could we put it? And if you do that search, you find in the Dataverse world, like, surprisingly little that exists. So it's almost completely devoid of other content from which they could build. And so you'd want to have a repository that has some aggregation capability. University of Chicago is another one that's doing the open data commons or something like that. I mean, we are looking at all of these places, and it seems like from a disease specific world, at least for Crohn's and for type 1 diabetes, there just aren't places to put the data. And I suspect it's going to be similar if you look at other biomedical areas that people have a long history of not sharing their data. And so that environment hasn't developed nearly like in other areas.
I could foresee too, if you got a place where everybody in this area is putting their data, as you have in proteomics and genomics, for instance, then people will be more inclined to do it, probably less reluctant to not share, because this is the place we all put it, that everybody finds me.
But like the
it's
genomics,
kind of sticky, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the genomics area is a great one. The genomics data is there, but what about all the outcomes data?
Yeah.
There is none.
Yeah.
A genome without outcomes, it isn't useless, but it's not very useful. So.
Next. Yes, up front.
Hi, Hannah Heckner with AAAS. Um, I would like your take on who you think has the responsibility in the ecosystem when you think about emerging repositories in different scientific disciplines, and as a publisher wanting to create as frictionless of an environment for the publication process as possible for the authors, but also knowing that, especially with AAAS being so interdisciplinary and with the science journals covering so much content, I mean, it's like would be like playing whack-a-mole if we were going
Yeah.
to be integrating with every single one of these repositories. So where's the onus on listening to authors and knowing that your platform is giving respectability and recognition to different repositories?
I can share one thing that I learned yesterday. So, just, I suppose, a disclaimer. I sit on the board of directors of Dryad, so that is a data repository. And Dryad has been really working because one of the things when we were integrating or we were working with Taylor and Francis on our policies, I said it's really frustrating that Scholar One and Manuscript Central, for instance, which are peer review management systems, are not thinking about these things yet. And actually, both of the systems are now have on the horizon when they're going to release. So they're working on actually allowing that. One of them, and I would have to pull up my notes to remember which one, is just for Dryad right now, but the other, I think it was Scholar One, is actually going to be for multiple. Obviously, then you've got to decide which ones you are going to integrate with. I think another thing to know, because the other thing we also found challenging, and I know that Spring of Nature had this conversation as well, is so if I were to say, here's some recommended repositories, on what basis am I recommending? And so there's also a conversation going on across publishers about having kind of a collective list of repositories and how they fulfill. I don't know if you've had any thoughts about which, or yourselves, about which you integrate with. I think a lot have had Figshare earlier because it was easy because we were using that for supplemental materials. But I think when we get down to thinking about the data repositories, we're at least taking a very hard look at which are the leading, which are broad repositories that we need to be thinking about. And probably there needs to be multiple, because it's a little like if you're a researcher, you want to have multiple journals. I think journals probably need multiple repositories because they will fulfill different needs for different subject areas.
All right.
Yes, I mean, on the integration, I agree that's tricky because there are probably many more repositories that you can integrate with, also depending on how even the repositories and your manuscript management system is set up, etc. From my perspective, if you can integrate, do it. Again, anything that makes the researcher's life easier will help. But otherwise, the useful thing, as Caroline was mentioning, was to have a set of recommended repositories that covers the disciplines that you cover with your journal, because you also have to account that, again, you may have many communities and they all like to use the repository. And it is important to also support the repositories that are discipline specific. Again, that's how the knowledge gets built, because you have the same data sets in the same, curated in the same way with the same metadata that you can then aggregate and build more knowledge from. So at PLOS, what we have is a list of recommended repositories. I believe Springer Nature also has a list. What probably would help is to try to be transparent as to what the criteria are. And the other thing I would mention around this is that this thing about having a set of recommendations and being transparent is something that in other conversations with funders in Europe, they are also very keen on having, because they don't want to be overly prescriptive for authors, but they also want to give them some guidance as to where to send their data set.
Yeah.
I just found my notes. Sorry. So Aries, which is editorial manager, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. They are looking to, right now, I understood the release date is sometime in the spring of 2020, late spring. Could be delayed. You never know with these types of things. And that it won't cost for publishers to turn that on if you're using editorial manager, is what I was told. Don't quote me because I'm not Aries, but this is what I heard. And that Scholar One is also looking to do that. But right now, initially, it's just with connecting with Dryad, but perhaps in future it might be others. Whereas the other is for all.
There is one point, because we kind of glossed over it, but and this is maybe peculiar to biomedical data since it's around an individual, that one thing that will make it hard to have a repository is that there are different regulatory requirements country to country. So what you do in Europe may be different than what you do in the US. And I mean, that's the state of the world. So, to comply with everything is probably highest common denominator. So it's GDPR. And in the US, it's not GDPR.
Yeah. There's no such thing. Just to add to the comments, I don't know if you're following the Enabling Fair Data initiative coming out of the American Geophysical Union, but one of the things that they're doing as a follow-on is developing a repository finder. And I don't know what the criteria are. Are you in DC?
Yes.
So,
JPS, I believe, is on that group.
okay, well, Shelley Stahl at AGU is the person
Yeah.
to talk to. Somebody's got the microphone. Yeah.
Hi. Question about the next steps for the forum after this. So the intention now obviously is to have some type of reproducible data use recommendations, but are there also concurrent discussions being had about data reusability and what will successful look like for the Belmont Forum and globally at that point? If all the data is up there and accessible and no one's using it, is that still successful in your eyes?
Yeah, so Belmont has a vision. Uh, the implementation is very much step by step. So at the moment, the focus is on actually developing an outline for a data management plan, so that when grantees get their awards, they have a framework to follow. Moving further forward, and Belmont doesn't have its own repository. It is just part of the scientific ecosystem. So part of the whole issue of what is transdisciplinary, which is one of Belmont's hallmarks, is to make sure that the outputs and outcomes coming out of science, out of the science that they fund, is more than, no offense here, is more than just a published article. And so I anticipate that as time moves forward, the whole issue of what is happening to the data that's being generated by Belmont projects is going to be part of the overall evaluation of the effectiveness of Belmont's policies, and then making adjustments as they need to. But at the moment, I can't give you a codified answer to that, but it's definitely part of the equation.
I know one of the recommendations that was made for funders around this, and it was around making data sharing communities, was to have funders fund people that reuse data.
Yeah.
And I've presented that to the trust, and let's just say it hasn't gone over all that well yet. So
yeah, there's a lot of this that is definitely further down the line, but it's a good question. More. Yes, can we get a microphone over here, please? Thank you. Okay, we're running out of time, but so we can do a couple of more questions. All right, he says last question. He's in charge, not me. Okay, yes,
Hi, how's it
please.
going? I'm Trevor Riley from National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
From NOAA. So I'm a librarian, but I've seen this in an academic area as well. And I think that working with those faculty and the graduate students, it seems like a lot of them are completely
ignorant.
Let's not say clueless, but yes, ignorant to the point where faculty who are advising students just aren't even passing this message down. Where do you guys see in terms of improvements that can be made on a campus? Because I see that's kind of the groundswell. Like, where do you see the most improvement can be made?
I'll take that first, just because Belmont actually has looked at this a bit. One of the activities of the data management project that I outlined before was looking at what is it that non-data scientists need to be data smarter, better data managers. And there's a curriculum framework that Belmont developed that we're hoping that institutions will take up, so that even starting at the undergraduate level, certainly masters and beyond, that faculty will be starting to pay more attention. Perhaps there's activities that research librarians are getting involved in or can get involved in to reach out to the younger researchers. And then there are a lot of resources currently available through the ESIP online data training resource that they have. And I'll turn it over here.
Wow. I mean, there are many things that could be done. One thing that I think institutions could do is to care more about the data that their researchers are producing, to make sure that there are facilities. The question, the whole thing about the amount of data that has been paid for by funders that is sitting on student laptops is lamentable. It's extraordinary. And the thing that I've noted when scandal and fraud hits the news in science, almost to a man or woman, that when they're asked where the original data is, they say, "Oh, it was on my laptop, but my laptop crashed." Or there was one case, Jan Hendrik Schoen said, "Oh, the hard drive got full, so I deleted all the data so I could free up some data." I mean, there should be automatic data should automatically go to some central repository so that it can be checked, so that it can be collaborated. And I think that's the first that would help a lot. But I don't know of any people that are actually doing that. That's what they should be doing.
Quick comments.
So yeah, just quick comment from I would like to see librarians encouraged to use the standards. That's in a word. Use standards. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Okay. Last comment?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a bit kind of out of place talking about institutions, but something that I've seen at the University of Cambridge, UK, which is where the office is based, is that they've put a lot of effort on this also from the librarians providing support, but they have a program of data ambassadors where they are trying to do is members of faculty support the younger peers, and again, who will then hopefully perpetuate that with their other peers, so kind of build capacity internally.
Yeah, and the two higher ed associations in the U.S., AAU and APLU, have been starting to do some joint activities in this area that are going to be moving forward. Okay, we need to wrap up. Before we say thank you to everybody, I just want to point out that OASPA is having a webinar on these issues on June 6th. There are flyers at the end of the rows if you want to take a hard copy, and there's a website down below. In the meantime, I'd like to thank our panel and all of you.